Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the Foreign Policy Initiative's event, DoD new report on China's military implications for the United States and our allies. And also, for those of you who tried to taxi in, thank you for somehow surviving the taxi strike that's going right outside the halls of Congress. The Foreign Policy Initiative, for those of you who don't know, is a 501c3 non-partisan not-for-profit that tries to make the argument to educate, engage, empower policymakers, lawmakers, journalists, the public about the need for American leadership in domains of security, economics and trade, human dignity, human rights, democracy promotion. And as part of that, we spend a lot of time here on Capitol Hill holding public events to have dialogue, debates about key issues of U.S. foreign policy. And today we're going to be talking about the People's Republic of China, its military, but also just the larger palette of U.S. policy towards Asia, including the Asia rebalance. And we are very honored here today to have Congressman J. Randy Forbes, member from the 4th District of Virginia, native of Chesapeake, Virginia, who also chairs the House Armed Services Committee on Subcommittee on Seapower. Congressman Forbes is a leading voice on defense and national security related issues, an advocate for the military, those who serve, and a real leader on issues. We've had the pleasure of working with him and his staff for many years, since our formation in 2009. In addition, Congressman Forbes is also a member of the Committee on the Judiciary, as well as one of the co-chairs and founders of the Congressional China Caucus, among other caucuses. And before coming to Congress, Congressman Forbes was a member of the Virginia House of Delegates, Virginia State Senate, and chairman of the Republican Party of Virginia. And so it's a real pleasure to have a leader in Congress and on Asia issues. Congressman Forbes, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and I want to just thank the Foreign Policy Initiative for the good work that they do, for all your coordination in doing this. You've got a wonderful panel that's sitting up here, and they were having to do what we all have to do here, which is to think and eat at the same time as they were getting ready for this panel. But you're very fortunate to have these kind of minds and thought power come in at such an important issue. And I know so many of you in here have studied these issues, and you could easily jump up on this panel or jump up here and give us some great thoughts today. And so I'm going to be brief and simply try to open up a couple of avenues of thought for you. And I want to kind of begin by saying, one, what we're trying to do in Congress. You know, the President began by saying that we needed to have a pivot to the Asia-Pacific area, and then, of course, we refined that nomenclature to be a rebalance to the Asia-Pacific area. Whatever you call it, whatever it is, I think it is fair to say that there should be a focus on at least raising ideas and discussing what the role of the United States should be in the Asia-Pacific area. And the executive branch took that initiative, and we've been trying to do the same thing now to Congress, and to have Congress try to do that pivot or rebalance, to at least begin having those discussions of what our role should be, both congressionally and as a nation. And in doing that, we firmly believe that in the marketplace of ideas, truth will win out and work its way up, but you have to have that marketplace of ideas. And this morning I only had a couple of observations I wanted to offer you, and the first one is this. I have a friend of mine who, when he first came to Congress, sought out what he felt was a very wise individual to get some sort of wisdom from him about what he should be doing. And he went to Henry Hyde, who many of you know was a very formidable figure here for years, served on the Judiciary Committee. And he went in to ask Henry if he would give him some guidelines and some wisdom of what he should do. And Henry looked at him and he said, "What you do here is important." And my friend just kind of then brushed that aside like that was the preface of, "Okay, now tell me what you want to tell me." And then Henry told him again, "What you do here is important." And my friend said, "Okay," he kind of got that to himself. And then Henry said, "What you do here is important." And then Henry got up and he left. And I say that because sometimes we forget, because we have a lot of folks up here who start thinking they are important. Well, they're not really important because, we all know elections and lives are so fragile that we come and go, based on one beat of a heart or one poll or one election that takes place. But what you do here, even in this discussion and this debate, is important. And if you leave here with nothing else, I'd like to leave you with that message. And if I could give you 3 observations today, it would be what you do is important, what you do is important, and what you do is important. And then the next thing I would tell you is this: as you listen to this panel today, begin to discuss and give their ideas on this annual report. I want to kind of do 2 bookends for you. And I won't give you the 2 authors, but I read what all you guys write, and we're kind of nerdy in our office, and we do a lot of that stuff. But just taking 2 articles talking generally about this area. One of them begins by saying this, and I'm paraphrasing the article a little bit. It says, China's military is improving its military doctrine. China's military is improving its training. China's military is improving its weapons. China's military is improving its surveillance. And then it says this: to be able to conduct more sophisticated attacks against the United States and other adversaries. Now, if you think that's a fair reading of what this report says, which I believe it is, then I want you also to go to another article as the other bookend that says this. It says that China basically has had 3 different phases. One phase was to say basically that we're using our military muscle in a defensive posture. The second one was to say we're using our military muscle, but only when we can justify, at least plausibly, that it was a defensive muscle. And the third one is what this author called a proactive assertiveness, which is where they are today. And I will tell you that if you look at that kind of skeleton, it buttresses with what I'm hearing more and more of our military leaders saying in my office privately, because it patterns what happened in the business arena with China. They first started saying, we just want to be a player. And then it was, we wanted to be a partner. And then once they got the economic muscle, it's, we want to drive and train. And I don't say that negatively. I say that because here's my concern. Recently, the CNO had something that he said that I think was very, very crucial to this whole debate. And I have enormous respect for him. He is a wonderful man. He's doing a great job. If you walked in here, Dad, quickly sit down so you could listen to him and all of his ideas. But he said this, and many of you probably heard the exchange or read it. He said, when it comes to China, if we even talk about them, then, and the potential that they could be competitors or aggressive, we have crossed a line that we should not cross if we talk about them publicly. And I want to just raise this question to you and follow me around the globe. We had our missile defense systems in Europe, and the Russians basically said, that's offending us. And we said, oh, we don't want to offend you. Let's take our missile defense systems out of Europe. And we have huge gaps in our missile defense systems today. Flip on over to Iran, and the Iranians said, if you want to talk to us, we're offended by your sanctions. And so we said, okay, let's take off our sanctions, and so we can sit down and chat with you. If you go to the Afghan insurgents, the big thing the Afghan insurgents wanted was to give them a time certain to pull out. And we said, okay, let's give you a time certain to pull out. And when I look at why we have the militaries that we have, it's because we want to deter, if we can, bad actions from taking place. Whether they take place from good actors or bad actors or whatever it is. But I am really concerned when we reach the point where we say to any nation in the world that you can have a veto on what we even talk about publicly in the marketplace of ideas. Because how do I dare send a message out that we are going to have any kind of deterrence at all if I say we're not even willing to talk about an issue if it's going to dare offend you? And so I throw out to you today to remember that what you are doing here is important. Number two, that our true competitive advantage in the world is not just our technology and our military. It is our ideas. And in those ideas, I truly believe in the marketplace of ideas. Truth will win out. But where is that marketplace? Should it be a group of people in closed doors in the Pentagon who are talking about this? Or should it be all of us in a public forum and a public debate? And I would suggest to you it's the latter. And that's why I'm so appreciative of what you are doing and the debates that you are having here. And then as I wrap up with what you are doing is important, let me also leave you with one thing that I have said to a number of people over the last several months. More and more today, I'm having ambassadors that find their way into my office on a weekly basis because they're saying, we really have a hard time finding out what our strategy is around the world, and can you help share some of that with us? And I had an ambassador in my office months ago, and he looked at me after we were discussing some things that we wanted to do in this country, and he said, you know, Congressman, we made some significant cuts to national defense in our country, and the world didn't come to an end. And I looked over, and I literally put my hand on his shoulder, and I said, Mr. Ambassador, you're exactly right. I said, but if you had miscalculated, if you had judged incorrectly, if you had made a mistake, who would your backstop have been? And he said, you. And I said, we don't have a backstop for freedom in the world. We are the backstop for freedom in the world. That's why it's so crucial what you do, what this panel does, this debate of ideas, because we can't get it wrong. We can't miscalculate. We can't judge wrong, because all of us, this nation, is the backstop of freedom for the world. So thank you for what you do. Thanks for being here today. Panelists, thank you for your ideas, and we look forward to hearing what your results are.
Congressman Forbes for his leadership in Congress, for his important work, sir, important work. Not only on the House Armed Services Committee, but also on the Congressional China Caucus, which he co-chairs and which made today's event possible. Next, we're going to turn to the panel, and to the panel on which we'll be discussing initially the DoD's new report on China's military, its implications for us and our allies, but also expand to the wider context of the Asia rebalance, the region, and what's at stake in terms of America's efforts to advance security, prosperity, and human dignity in the region. I guess I'll just introduce each speaker and then go ahead. But just quickly, we'll be having Mark Stokes, Oriana Mastro, and Dan Blumenthal. So Mark Stokes, who will start us off, is Executive Director of the Project 2049 Institute. Previously, he was founder and president of Quantum Pacific Enterprises, a consulting firm, and also Vice President and Taiwan Country Manager at Raytheon. And he's served in other various capacities, both in the private sector and the like. He's also a 20-year Air Force veteran, and serving as a team chief and senior country director for the PRC, Taiwan, Mongolia, and the Office of the Secretary of Defense for National Security Affairs. He holds an undergraduate degree from Texas A&M University and graduate degrees in international relations from Boston University and the Naval Postgraduate School. And he also happens to be a fluent Mandarin speaker. I've had the pleasure of traveling with him, I believe, to Japan and Taiwan. Japan, please. He's one of those guys who's forgotten more in this town than most people ever know about these subjects, and so I'm very glad to be here on the stage with him. So please, Mark will start us off talking a little bit about the report and some other observations.
Excellent. Thank you, Bob, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and an honor to have this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics, and to be able to discuss an issue in which I was intimately that took up a significant amount of my time, Dan's time, and others when we were working within the Office of Secretary of Defense. And so what I'll try to keep my remarks brief, 7 minutes, at most 10 minutes, but try to limit it to 7 minutes. Start off a bit about the history of the report. How did this report come about? How did the requirement come about? What's some of the background? how was it developed? Bear in mind, this is several years ago. And then secondly, a little bit on the substance of the report. I think the report speaks for itself. And I think stating up front that I think the report is well done. And then, but try to spend a considerable amount of time now talking about offering some suggestions or considerations for future reports, at least some other things maybe perhaps to include. Starting off with the history of the report. The annual report of Congress on Pearson military power, or military security developments as it's called now, it didn't just come out of thin air. That there was a lot of background that went into it. It's a product in some respects to the early 1990s and some of the issues that were going on then in the mid 1990s. It was an environment that produced requirements from Congress for a significant number of military reports or reports on the People's Republic of China between, let's say, 1995 all the way up to 1999. Just a whole series of them. Starting off with, for example, of course, a lot of it started off with the satellite sales issue. And some of the, when we were selling satellites to the People's Republic of China, with an exception under 1989 Tiananmen sanctions, and also, of course, using Chinese launch services. And some things that happened within there in terms of a lapse in some of the technology oversight mechanisms that were established to ensure safeguards of U.S. technology. And some requirements that came out of that. But the key report that really started things off would have been one that was produced probably in 96, a requirement that came out of the House Armed Services Committee, to be able to have some very specific questions on to address in terms of People's Liberation Army technical development, technological developments. And very specific things. I forgot how many areas, maybe 15, 20 areas. It was a fairly brief report, but it was substantive, I thought. This is before my time. I arrived in OSD in 1997. But that was followed up with, bear in mind that this also was a lot of things going on with Taiwan, particularly after the 1996 missile exercises. And so Taiwan became a significant requirement in terms of congressional reporting requirements. To look at things like, for example, there's a report that came out in 1998 called Security Situation in the Taiwan Strait. There were additional requirements from Congress to do more to brief Congress on the Taiwan Relations Act, implementation of the Taiwan Relations Act, particularly related to two provisions in the TRA. One of which, of course, is the provision of necessary defense articles and services to Taiwan. And also something called another provision to maintain the capacity to resist use of force and other forms of coercion against Taiwan. And so Taiwan was very much front and center behind the things that eventually resulted in this report to Congress. There was also concerns over the military relationship. And again, related to some part with Taiwan, because it just didn't seem right to have so much going on with the People's Republic of China, PLA, and have very, very limited activities going on with our friends from Taiwan. And there's also, of course, back then, missile defense issues that were on, and produced a report on missile defense architecture in the Asia-Pacific region, but really is a Taiwan at the center. It's just easier to get something passed within Congress if you can sort of put it in the broader context, not just focus on Taiwan. People forget that missile defense was a very, very controversial issue back in the 1990s. But in terms of the process, but it ended up because there were so many reporting requirements out there. The House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee, the staffers came together and came up with the concept of trying to combine a lot of these issues into one report and having a sustained report that would be produced on an annual basis. At the time in the Office of Secretary of Defense, we were responsible for sort of taking that requirement and then sort of coordinating the development and the staffing of the report. In OSD at the time, as Dan knows, between the 80s all the way up until about 2000, there was only 2 permanent billets within OSD. Of course, then we had some on loan, for example, from DIA or Department of Commerce or political appointees, Schedule C appointees after a while. And so we just didn't have the staffing really to do the report on our own. And most importantly, the idea was to just simply write a letter and get it signed by the Deputy Assistant Secretary or Undersecretary of Defense or Assistant Secretary to the Defense Intelligence Agency to come up with the classified and unclassified versions. In that sense, we would not get accused of trying to politicize reports that were developed by the Intelligence Committee. And of course, they also could understand better what could be said in unclassified realm, because what really matters is what's unclassified. The classified report, of course, is important, but what really matters is really what's available to the public. So signed a letter, and the Intelligence Committee, DIA in particular, and then would staff their product within the Intelligence Committee, was pretty much responsible for developing the report. Over the course of the last 5, 7, or even 10 years, I understand that's OSD has expanded quite a bit in terms of the China-Taiwan desk separated, and so and a lot of that task of developing a report has been sort of been brought within OSD itself. I don't know if that's accurate statement, if that's my understanding. So, but today the report stands, in terms of publicly, the most important baseline, the most important and authoritative reference on the People's Liberation Army and the Chinese military that exists within in public policy. And so for those of us in the public policy domain, it is an important baseline, and it's very, very useful to what we do, just to measure what we're seeing sort of other research and see what they have and how it measures up with the annual report. So it's a very, very important reference. Secondly, the substance of the report that speaks for itself, as I mentioned before, is well done. I mean, there's some things that stood out in this year's report that were slight differences from previous reports. Bear in mind, that's one of the utilities that you can see minor differences in wording as you look at these things, look at the reports from year to year. But things like, of course, things that I focus on, for example, slight more detail on a mobile, merged, or multiple independently retardable vehicle ICBMs developed. That's good to have that out there. Interesting enough, a reference to the development, investment in the production of a conventional intermediate range ballistic missile, IRBM, notionally have a range of, like, let's say, 3,500, 5,000 kilometer range in that area, which is significant. Of course, as usual, it has a good assessment of the defense budget, and worth noting, is a commendable reference to the difficulty in actually assessing PLA military spending and defense budget. It makes, I think, notable reference to some of the difficulties, some of the weaknesses of the PLA, and some of the shortcomings they have actually in, for example, conducting an amphibious assault or amphibious landing, physical occupation of Taiwan, and some of the challenges they face there. And also, of course, acknowledging something a little bit different in this year's report, acknowledging some of the progress that Taiwan has made in its defense modernization, in terms of developing, to use the buzzword these days, not sure exactly what this means, but innovative and asymmetrical approaches to do defense. And of course, what's interesting, that I would worthy of note, that's often forgotten these days with all the activities in the South China Sea and East China Sea, is, to quote, preparation for a Taiwan conflict with the possibility of U.S. involvement continues to dominate China's military modernization program. This sounds strange because of all, again, with all the attention on in South China Sea and East China Sea, but Taiwan indeed does remain the primary driver, which leads to some of the conclusions that we'll have in this. So I'd sort of put that out. Now, finally, in terms of recommendations on future reports, the report's well done, as it been in previous years, and this report I think was put together very well. But here's just some things to think about that could augment the report. Number one, there's a lot of attention on hardware issues, military modernization, which is important. But bear in mind, as Americans, we tend to think in black and white, or zeros and ones. For example, we're either at war or we're not at war. Or look at military terms in terms of pure hardware terms. Now, the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party thinks about things differently. In a sense, they're in a constant state of warfare. Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek both said warfare is 70% political, 30% military. So within the People's Liberation Army, they give, in some ways, more emphasis to a constant state of warfare, political warfare to be exact. And indeed, they have a large organization that's dedicated to political warfare. In the old days, and this is not necessarily to say that the People's Republic of China is the same as the Soviet Union, because of course Beijing would accuse me and others, for example, of what they call Cold War mentality, because there are some differences. However, China's approach to political warfare was adopted in large part from the former Soviet Union, and common practices that were within the Comintern, the old Comintern. So what would be interesting, and the Soviets conducted political warfare, and they were organized to do it, and did it very well. It took a while to recognize that they were organized and funded and resourced to do it. But it got to the point where Congress, in the mid-1980s, mandated a report to Congress on Soviet, what's called active measures. The term they use for political warfare is Soviet active measures. And this would, for example, would include what's called gray propaganda or black propaganda. In other words, inserting things in the media to try to shape perceptions, to try to get foreign countries to be able to shift, to influence operations in terms of the way they do things. Within the PLA, they have an organization that is just as large and has just as much status and equal in stature as all of the conventional brigades opposite Taiwan, which is substantial for those that follow the Chinese military, which is a corps, basically equivalent to Army Corps. It's a larger effort that they have to be able to engage in active measures in political warfare. That is a very large organization and very well resourced that operates behind the scenes. That's not noticed. So if this report, annual report to Congress, was in part modeled upon the old Soviet report, the report to Congress on Soviet military power, then one consideration could be some attention to including in here reporting of activities that could be directly or indirectly linked to the main organization responsible for political warfare, which is the General Political Department Liaison Department, a core-level organization that's something we don't have. It's hard for Americans to grasp this, but something that we don't have. We don't have an organization that does this. They have one that is able to manipulate perceptions and to be able to change the theme and to be actually amplify or attenuate actual military power on a day-to-day basis. They seek political effect on a daily basis through military actions and military activities. But so an idea would be sort of inclusion in there of activities that could be traced to General Political Department and associated platforms, directly or indirectly, that are intended to be able to shape perceptions, deter, coerce, dissuade, not only the United States, but also Taiwan in particular. Bear in mind that Taiwan's democracy is pretty much the only democracy that actually is under persistent threat and subversion, to use that old Cold War term, almost on a daily basis. So that's number one in terms of suggestion. Now, related to this, though, and sort of an earmark of how successful that the PRC or the Chinese Communist Party has been in shaping perceptions. I often, for example, attend some classes or give presentations to smaller groups. The first question I ask is, does Taiwan, under its existing Republic of China Constitution, exist as an independent sovereign state? Of course, if they're from Taiwan or familiar with the issue, of course, they'll say, of course we are. I mean, of course we are. No question. However, most Americans don't even realize this, that actually there are two legitimate governments that exist on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. But Beijing, over the last 30 years, if not more, has been so successful in shaping the idea that there is only one legitimate government that can represent people on Taiwan and in mainland China on its own, and they've been successful in doing that. And that's the way that we conduct business and do our foreign policy today, which is based upon a skewed version of objective reality. And so what would be interesting would be simply inclusion in the report, some section that assess the conditions under which the Central Military Commission would acknowledge, if not accept, an accurate representation of the status quo in the Taiwan Strait. And that status quo is the existence of two legitimate governments that both have their own sort of one-China principles. But of course, the existence of two legitimate governments, in which the United States could engage in a more normal relationship, a more balanced relationship with both sides of the Taiwan Strait within a very broad one-China framework that would within a much more creative and broad. And I would reference a proposal that was put forward from a bipartisan group in Taiwan that was sort of outlined sort of a greater one-China formula. But what's in there also is a recipe or a way forward to consider on how to adopt a more normal relationship with the United States and the ROC, or Taiwan, to use that term. So thirdly, and I'll finish up here real quick, what would be interesting to add in the report, and it does have some in there, but a little bit more on weaknesses. There's a lot of effort that goes into looking at the capabilities that exist, but both existing and latent or potential. But a little bit more on operational weaknesses of the PLA. The PLA is getting good, but they're not 10 feet tall. And there are weaknesses that exist in every system, every military system, and a little bit more to be able to identify those weaknesses in addition to some of the strengths. And then finally, I would note that in this report itself, this has been added in the last 5 or 6 years, but there's a little line at the bottom of the report that says, preparation of this report cost the Department of Defense approximately $89,000 in fiscal, the preparation of it. I would ask this, the military relationship with China, which is part of the annual report, is certainly important. And of course, our military relationship with Japan is important. Military relationship with Taiwan and every other military around the world. In fact, one could say that our relationship with allies and friends would be actually more important in many ways than the relationship within those that are in the others category. But military with China is important. What would be interesting, though, would be to include, similar to this sort of idea, how much the report costs, how much does the military relationship with China cost? I mean, in real money terms. I mean, think about it, it actually costs quite a bit. How much does one airplane cost, special airplane flight cost? But it costs both in terms of monetary terms, in terms of taxpayer money that goes in to the military relationship, but also some other costs, for example. For example, the cost that it has on, for example, our relationship with allies and friends in the region, from Taiwan, the Philippines, Japan, South Korea, and others. So. And with that, again, I appreciate it. I'll turn it back over to you.
Mark, thank you for your comments. And next we'll turn to Oriana Mastro, who is Assistant Professor of Security Studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, where her research focuses on the China military and security policy, wider Asia issues, war termination, of course, diplomacy. She is also a U.S. Air Force reservist, and in that capacity, she works as an Asia-Pacific strategist at the Pentagon. I should probably stress, your comments are your personal views and represent no one else's. Previously, she's worked in a lot of different capacities. Dr. Mastro has at CNAS, at Carnegie Endowment, RAND Corporation, PACOM, Project 24/9 as well. And she's also testified for the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. She is highly proficient in Mandarin, to which I can attest, having traveled with her and other folks in Beijing. She saved my life against taxi drivers one day. And she also worked at a Chinese valve manufacturing firm in Beijing as a translator and has made appearances on Chinese language debate shows. She holds a BA in East Asian Studies from Stanford University and an MA and PhD in Politics from Princeton University. And also your dissertation chair will be testifying today, I believe, at Aaron Friedberg, correct?
Yeah.
At the Center for Foreign Relations Committee. So without further ado, Dr. Mastro, Oriana, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Bobby, for having me today. He had mentioned, in my military capacity, I've worked much more intimately on these issues. I was actually, as of last week, selected to be our new Reserve Area Attaché in Beijing, so I'm very excited about that. So I obviously am very biased about the mil-to-mil relationship and how important it is. But because of this, I just want to re-emphasize again that my views are my own and don't represent the views of any organization or institution of which I have been or currently am a part. The purpose of this report, I think, is to inform and identify trajectories. Mark had mentioned it's been very important in establishing baselines, which then therefore helps us figure out what the important trends are. So today, I'm actually going to take this time to highlight what I think the trajectories are, the future trends I see emerging based on this information. So these aren't sort of trends that are that apparent right now. These are sort of my interpretation of the report if you read it closely and have read previous reports that closely. So the bottom line is there's a few things I want to bring your attention to in this report, and more open it up for discussion about whether or not these perhaps are some trends that you all see as well. The first is that the capabilities of the Chinese military and the trends of where those capabilities are going in the future have moved beyond basic modernization. China is no longer satisficing. They're no longer a country that's just trying to build up the basic minimum of capabilities necessary for their defense. In my view, they're moving more and more towards a mentality of maximizing. They're trying to be the best or one of the best in key military capability areas. They are spending an increased amount of effort on expeditionary capabilities, and it seems to me that while, of course, the focus is still on regional contingencies, and for those in this room, the focus is still on A2AD capabilities, right? China's ability and their strategy of anti-access and area denial. Impacting operations far from their shores is no longer the only goal. In my view, they're moving more and more towards wanting to operate farther from their shores as well. And combined with this and related is that China's military impact on global affairs is increasing. If you look through this report and previous reports, you can see this influence is increasing. And the third thing I'd like to bring your attention to is that China's response to this report, I think, highlights a trend that has just begun, which is that China is no longer satisfied with the U.S.-led regional order. Their actions and rhetoric suggest this, and trends show that the Chinese leadership believe that significant military capabilities is necessary to achieve whatever China's strategic goals are. So going through those sort of three ideas very briefly. The first one, that the trends, I think, are moving beyond A2AD. They're moving beyond basic modernization. The report highlights that China's military investments provide it with a growing capability of projecting power abroad. The 2003 report really did emphasize those A2AD missions and capabilities. But the 2014 report explicitly states that China is now more focused on military investments for a range of operations beyond their coasts, including things like sea lane security, counter-piracy, peacekeeping, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Now, in my own research, I've been chronicling sort of Chinese nationals abroad, and how I think one estimate is by 2020, in terms of travel and living, we'll see 100 million Chinese nationals abroad. Threats to those nationals are increasing, partially because they find themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, partially because they're being targeted. Threats to Chinese commercial interests are increasing. And there's a domestic debate in China, and it was added to their white paper for the first time, that they need to start developing limited expeditionary capabilities designed to protect these interests. So I think we're seeing this, that the view is not so much, keep the United States from operating, but, hey, we also want to be able to do some of these operations ourselves. So if we look at this report, we can see a pattern. And it seems that, of course, their main focus is on, counter-intervention and keeping other countries from operating close to their shores, but they're also thinking more and more of the conditions under which and how they would be able to develop capabilities to operate farther out. So in extending beyond their coast, if you look at the additions to the report for 2nd Artillery, those are mainly, I think, and Mark touched upon some of them, are focused on the HASC threat, but the PLA additions, in which the Chinese military is focused largely on enhanced mobility and increasing their special operations forces, and in the Chinese literature, there's a lot of emphasis on the role special operations could play in things like hostage rescue or raids in dealing with some of these overseas threats. And the improved Army aviation units that will use helicopters and enhanced C2 capabilities seems to me to also not only have regional implications, but implications a little beyond the region as well. Some of the PLAF additions, we noted in last year's report that China was developing a large transport aircraft, the Y-20. This year they're testing this aircraft, and so it would be necessary if China were to move in a direction of actually being able to conduct their own operations, that they would have such airlift and hopefully for them sea lift capabilities as well. In terms of the Navy additions, again, things like the first Luoyang 3 class missile destroyers are entering into service. The Chinese, for the first time, publicly announced their desire to build more indigenous aircraft carriers. These, again, are capabilities that, while, of course, they are also a part of trying to control other countries' ability to operate close to China's shores, they also might be able, in some future date, to use those to conduct operations themselves. The space and counter space, in the report, it mentioned that Beijing had tested its first quick reaction launch vehicle. And this, I think, is extremely significant. Going back to Mark's point on focusing on the hardware, the Chinese understand that in order to sort of fight in any effective way in modern conflicts, they do need to have C4ISR capabilities to carry out joint operations. So that's command, control, communications, computers, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. This goes back to my previous point, which is they're no longer focused on just developing things like ASATs to keep the United States from having access to C4ISR. They also want their own C4ISR. So both of those, I think, are goals that are being simultaneously pursued. One thing that was left out of the report that I see important in this is Xi Jinping's emphasis on improving the PLA's position in society. I was just in Shanghai, I guess, 3 weeks ago, and every time I turned on the TV, there was another one of these huge military, like a theater filled with thousands of military members, in which they had like famous singers come, and in the background it was all the China dream, strong China. I'm willing to make the ultimate sacrifice for my country. And little things that maybe we don't notice, but as a member of the military myself, I see these as significant, which is policies were just passed to give military members discounts on train rides in China. I think Xi Jinping's focus on sort of preparing for military struggle is not about the United States. It's about the fact that they need the domestic support for this military modernization. And they want the people in China to feel the same way about their military as perhaps we do in the United States. Support their troops regardless of whether or not, in some cases, you support what those missions those troops are engaging in. Fortunately, the PLA's main mission is still internal stability operations, which is a nice way of saying dealing with dissidents and repression, so that's a hard task for Xi. The second point, and this is connected to the first, is that China's influence globally, the global impact, is increasing beyond Asia. Now we know this in the political realm and the economic realm, but I think this report really highlights that this trend is present in the military realm as well. In 2013, China conducted 7 bilateral, multilateral exercises with foreign militaries. They've signed $10 billion in agreements for conventional arms, and their amount of arms exports is only going to increase as their defense industrial complex continues to improve. They maintain 1,900 observers and troops in 10 operations, with PKO operations at the end of 2013, and they're continuing this counter-piracy mission in the Gulf of Aden. So just bring up this point to say that as their impact on global politics increases, I think the United States needs to give some serious thought to what is the role that we want China to have. We often say we want China to be a responsible stakeholder and be more involved, but I think if China changes its position on the non-interference policy, changes its views, and starts to more proactively secure its own national interests abroad, we might regret that we ever mentioned that we hoped that they would get rid of the non-interference policy. A more hands-on Beijing in Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia may not actually be what we want in the end. And the last point is on China's response to this report. I've noticed in the past couple of years an increased Chinese dissatisfaction with the US-led regional order. Now, people always sort of push back on this and they say, but China benefits so much from the role of the United States, right? It keeps Japan from remilitarizing, the US Navy protects the slots, and so there's free trade. Yes, this is what China said in the mid-1990s. China no longer says this. China, any sort of writing, official, unofficial, blog posts, what have you, highlights the fact that they think that the US-led regional order is a destabilizing factor in the region and is an obstacle to their rise. This is important, and I think we waste a lot of time and effort trying to convince the Chinese to feel differently than they do, versus, from a strategist's point of view, accepting this new trend, something that's potentially very dangerous, new view that's in China, and reacting accordingly. So reports, they argue in their media that reports like this Powell report make it difficult for China to feel like they're being treated fairly. It's not going to calm disputes, it's only going to provoke all the countries in the region. A Phoenix TV survey on people's opinions in China about this, 83% said the report was a political maneuver designed to distort facts. And they argue in many of these writings that a large part of sort of the rebalancing strategy, the success of it will be based on whether or not the United States can successfully contain China. And they argue that this is a part of information warfare. The United States is building a case against China to justify any use of force. They basically see this report as a justification for U.S. containment strategy. Now, while the Congressman remarked on China's sensitivity, and it's true, some of this is rhetoric, but some of this is real sensitivity. Should we stop talking about it then, because they're so sensitive? I personally think not. I think we actually need to socialize the Chinese to criticism, something they haven't been used to. A Chinese interlocutor once said to me, China is now a great power, so we should be able to do whatever we want, and no one should say anything about it. And my response was, that's the opposite of a great power. No matter what you do, everybody has something to say about it. And so criticism is something that on an individual level we get used to. When I was at PACOM as a briefer, I remember going into my first briefing and they said, the commander can be very harsh in his critiques. And I said, I'm a third-year PhD. Maybe I cried the first couple times I tried to present in a room of academics, but I've never gotten up in front of academics without them telling me how all my ideas are wrong and what an idiot I am. This is going to be a piece of cake. I got desensitized to it. I developed a thick skin. And I think we need to talk about it more so the Chinese do the same. So on that note, I'm going to stop there. I think, again, these are trends and trajectories that I see affecting China and U.S.-China relationship in the future. As someone that focuses more on defense planning and defense strategy, I'm always looking 20 years out, and so I'm trying to identify some of the indicators today that is going to impact our policies tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Oriana. And last up to bat, but certainly not least, Dan Blumenthal, Director of Asian Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Mr. Blumenthal has served in both and advised the U.S. government on China and Asia issues for over a decade. From 2001 to 2004, he served as Senior Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the Department of Defense. He also subsequently served as a commissioner on the congressionally mandated U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission from 2005 to 2012, and also held the position as Vice Chairman in 2007. He's a member of a various number of advisory boards, and is frequently called in by the executive branch and the legislative branch and others to offer commentary. He publishes, produces also, like all these other folks up here. I have had the opportunity to co-publish something with him. and in addition is co-author of Awkward Embrace, the United States and China in the 21st Century, published in November 2012. Dan, please.
Thank you very much, Bobby and FPI. Thanks to my very smart and astute colleagues on this panel, and thanks to all of you for coming here. And hopefully, I can illuminate some things and be of service as I speak today. I started off in my policy career. I started off as a lawyer, actually, but talk about coming to tears when you first hand something in. New York, no less. But Mark Stokes was my first supervisor, and among many other things, including everything you possibly wanted to know about missiles, kind of the scene from Forrest Gump when he's talking about shrimp, all the different kinds of shrimp. And we learned, about every kind of missile there was. It was sort of Mark Stokes' missile shop. He also taught me some of the dark arts of bureaucratic warfare. Let me turn to that in this report. This report is definitely signed off by all national security agencies in the U.S. government, but there are little things when you read between the lines that are put in, snuck in, so that other people don't take them out. You have to look very carefully. I know they're all shocked that this happens when the Department of Defense and the Department of State and so on get together, but it does. And here's what I read between the lines of what this report is telling us. The Department of Defense is much more frustrated with China than it was last year. And you can tell because they're using words like friction. China's expanding interests are causing friction between its neighbors. They start off by talking about the PLAs bumping up against U.S. naval vessels like the USS Cowpens in 2013. They reiterate in the report that the U.S. neither accepts nor recognizes the Chinese air defense identification zone in Japan. They make mention of the fact that still to this day the Chinese are effectively occupying reefs in the Philippines. And on and on and on. The frustration is growing at the Pentagon, and this is kind of a cry for help by those sitting there, faceless but patriotic bureaucrats saying, help us, help us, help us. There are those who don't even want to mention China, as Congressman Forbes said, which, by the way, is one of, there are many sort of fallacies and things that just get in the way of good thinking and good policy. And one of those is this notion that if we treat China like an enemy, it'll become an enemy. China has made its decisions when we treat it like a friend. China has made its decisions when we treat it like an enemy. China has made its decisions no matter what we say or do. China has no qualms whatsoever about calling us an enemy, about talking about downing aircraft carriers, about talking about us as a threat. We should have no qualms whatsoever about calling a spade a spade. In fact, it probably will lead to a better and more mature relationship with China if we do so. So this is a cry for help. This has been an incredibly frustrating year, as we have seen also, not just by the activities of China, but the way the Department of Defense has conducted itself in places like the Shangri-La Dialogue, and Secretary Hagel really went at it with his Chinese counterpart, back and forth, about who's being more provocative. The Department of Defense is also telling you a couple other things. One is that the United States is losing its monopoly on precision strike and long-range precision strike capabilities. Period. The U.S. dominated it since the end of the Cold War. It no longer dominates the Chinese. The A2AD threats can get very confusing in my own view. I've always not been such a proponent of using those terms. Every country has anti-access area denial strategies, where the Chinese have coercive strategies, coercive power, and precision strike capabilities that you can shoot off from land, from sea, from the air. And that's what the Pentagon's telling you this year. The U.S. dominance in that field is coming to an end. It's not the Chinese getting ahead, it's just that the Chinese can do it too. With the satellites that Oriana talked about, with the cyber and other capabilities, and missile capabilities that Mark Stokes talked about with submarine service and Seapower. That's what they're going for, long-range, short-range, precision strike capabilities. of the kind they've been watching us do since the end of the Cold War. Whether you look at the first Persian Gulf War, the second Persian Gulf War, Kosovo, and on and on and on. That's what they're able to do. The Pentagon is also telling you, as Oriana pointed out, that China is conducting real live exercises that are getting more and more sophisticated with more and more fleets. The Maneuver 5 exercise that Oriana mentioned, it was a big, was a BFD, as our Vice President might say. They went from, in the Philippine Sea, they went with 3 fleets, there are 3 main fleets in China, and they essentially went around Japan and came back into the Philippines, into the South China Sea with a major flotilla. They proclaimed that they cracked the first island chain, which is a big goal for the Chinese, cracking that chain that goes down from the Aleutian to what we used to call the defense perimeter in U.S. Strategic doctrine. But they call it, they look at it as the chain that bottles them up on their one coast. They talked about dismembering Japan and cracking the first island chain and getting into the South China Sea. The Pentagon is telling you they were able to do it, as Oriana and others said, more mobility, more use of more fleets. Big deal. Big deal. Of course, as Mark mentioned, the highlights of new kinds of precision strike cruise and ballistic missiles. And the Pentagon says bases in Okinawa are in range, meaning the Chinese can take them out, and Guam from air-launched cruise missiles as well. So that's U.S. territory. So the Pentagon is telling you, as Oriana has just said also, that the extended reach into the Western Pacific is happening today. And let me emphasize, what we're talking about is happening today, the coercive uses of power. Mark mentioned the coercion that Taiwan lives under every day, both from political warfare, but also just having missiles pointed at you, makes you think differently about your future. But again, for all the talk we have about focusing on Asia and so on and so forth, the fact remains that the Chinese are creating facts on the ground, have made land grabs, effective land grabs, territorial grabs in the South China Sea. We haven't moved them an inch. We haven't moved them off. The ADIZ still sits there no matter what we say. The Chinese have put a few points on the board, and we haven't matched it. We don't have that much time left. We only have to 1:30, right?
We can run a little long.
Okay. So that's what they're telling you. Right? That's what they're telling you. But so the Chinese are a coercive precision strike military today. But let's go. They can, absent the United States, can create some serious damage. And let's also focus on one thing that doesn't come up too often, and that's nuclear power in China. Coercive nuclear power. The fact that China, we can have debates forever, and we will, with arms control types and HASC and DoD's about how many warheads and fissile material. Here's the big point to take away. China is modernizing their nuclear forces. They're the only country in Asia with nuclear forces, in East Asia with nuclear forces. That's a coercive tool every single day. Every single day that it's out there, it's a coercive tool. Once they put them on submarines, it's a coercive tool as well, because nobody else has them, besides the United States. Nuclear weapons, James Schlesinger, the great Secretary of Defense, who died this year, said when he was pushing back against attempts by some of his colleagues, and the Cold War colleagues, to remove nuclear weapons as a strategic tool of the United States, he said, but we use them every day for deterrent. I mean, every patrol in the seas is a deterrent. Now China has that too, and the rest of the countries don't have that. If what Oriana says is correct about wanting to change the regional order, which is probably true, then we can quickly see nuclear proliferation throughout East Asia, because all these countries can have nuclear weapons. It's just that our security guarantee, up to this point, in 2014, as we sit here, our security guarantee helped them to decide not to get nuclear weapons, but that doesn't last forever. Nothing lasts forever. Okay, let's focus. There's kind of a little bit of an overcorrection. So in 2001, when I came into the Pentagon, and Mark mentioned a little bit of the history, we were fighting against, we were the only Hawks in town. We were Hawks before it was cool. We were fighting against the million people disparaging, this is the million-man swim, you guys want to start a war with China. China's hollow military, remember all those articles? China's hollow military. In fact, if you really look back into the 1990s about who was right about China, it's Oriana's other two dissertation advisors, Tom Christensen, posing problems without catching up, where he first said these coercive uses of power means that China doesn't have to catch up to the United States, it can just use coercion in the region. Aaron Friedberg's right for rivalry kind of global picture. Mark Stokes' strategic modernization about how China was moving from a million-man swim to be able to use these coercive uses of power like missiles. Those are, if you really want to kind of say who got things right, those are 3 places to start. But anyway, no one was a hawk back then. We had to put out people who were questioning every little thing we said about China's military power, and now everybody's a hawk. It's I guess in that sense the report and we won. But there is a danger of going too far, and that's what both Oriana, I think, and Mark were mentioning. So we've gone from saying China's 0 feet tall to China's 10 feet tall. So what's the reaction of the policy community? Well, 0 feet tall, no problem, nothing to worry about. 10 feet tall, too big a problem, can't worry about it, let's do nothing. They're not 10 feet tall, they're about 6 feet tall. And I completely agree with pointing out weaknesses. I completely agree. The Chinese would be very confused by this, because with Oriana's correct narrative that we're just using this to contain them, and they're still very confused about whether they want to be perceived as strong or weak. Now, they probably want to be perceived as more strong than weak, but there are a lot of weaknesses, a lot. Number 1, no friends. China has no friends. North Korea is a friend. Burma's not even a friend anymore. When you're losing Burma as a friend, you're really in trouble. You got to think about how to make friends. The U.S. has a lot of friends all around the region that surround China. When China looks out and says the U.S. is encircling, containing us, they're halfway. We could, if they misbehave, easily. All those countries around China won't share the same threat perception. It wouldn't be too hard if we had a serious policy and strategy. And we said, China, if you move any further, you will be contained. You will be encircled. All those countries are our good friends. So, number 1 weakness, no friends. Number 2 weakness, lack of political legitimacy. I mean, part of these things that Oriana is mentioning about shoring up the military support for the party is because they have to shore up the military support of the party. The military is kind of losing its faith in the party, as are a lot of the Chinese people. Now, that's not to say, oh my goodness, they want America to come and form a democracy for them. No, that's not what they're saying. They're saying, we're just sick of the corruption, we're sick of the repression, we're sick of the pollution, we're sick of party and crony capitalism and all the rest of it. And you don't have to believe me. When the Chinese arrested Liu Xiaobo and Ai Weiwei, these 2 iconic figures, what did they arrest them on? They arrested them on being part of, now this is a throwback to the 1990s, because who knew the U.S. was still in this business, but they said, you are part of this conspiracy that the CIA and the Pentagon have with Chinese elements to bring down the party. Peaceful evolution, remember that term? Shirley, peaceful. It's, the U.S. has abandoned it. In the 1990s, the U.S. used to talk about peaceful evolution. That was our policy. We actually had a clear policy. We were going to evolve the CCP into a multi-party democracy. We've abandoned that long ago. But the CCP still believes no matter what we say or do that we're doing it. And that points to their weakness and their paranoia. And if we wanted to get tough, we would play on that weakness. Because if they're arresting people, if they're arresting icons and saying you're helping the United States bring us down, Western pollution, cultural imperialism, they're afraid. Number 1 weakness, lack of political legitimacy. Big strength of ours, it's probably difficult to hear here in Congress, but is our political legitimacy. No one's going to die if you make a mistake. Yet. A lot of other weaknesses. Land borders. We have let the Chinese have their way. You talk about defense budget debates in China. If you're the guy in the Chinese military saying, let's invest in killing the carrier, you win every time. No one's arguing for anything else. But what if we created a whole set of new problems for China? Or just to think about things. Land exercises with Vietnam, India, special operations exercises in Mongolia, what have you. The Chinese at least would have to start to defend things rather than just keep investing in these offensive capabilities to take down carriers. Big weakness that can be exploited. The question is, will be exploited. I think, I agree with Oriana on the regional order. I think the Chinese have seen an opening and have had it, and at the very least are taking a wrecking ball to the current order, maybe even to the international order. And when I say they may be taking a wrecking ball, it means I don't think they have thought through exactly what it means if the U.S. can no longer play a superpower role. So if the U.S. now has to go back into the Middle East and provide stability for Chinese oil and everyone else's oil and other reasons, and the Chinese keep pushing the United States in the South China Sea, that is taking a wrecking ball to the order because the U.S. provides the order. The U.S. will be stretched thin. Now, I don't think the Chinese have thought through the consequences of what happens if the U.S. just says, we can't do it anymore. We just can't do it anymore. I think that it's very easy to wreck it. I think it's very difficult to build it back up in any way, in any modicum of stability. But I do agree that they see their chance to wreck it. And so that is very dangerous. And it's very dangerous, and I think coming back to what the Congress can do and what the Congress can, what all of you can do, the important work you can do in terms of the oversight, is number one, point to the weaknesses. Make sure that DoD is reporting to you on the weaknesses, both to expose them for political warfare propaganda purposes, and have a whole list of weaknesses and vulnerabilities, what is China really scared of. Number two, what are you doing about them, DoD? What are you doing about them? You just pointed, I would lucky all the things you could possibly think of that China's scared about. SLOC protection, what Oriana mentioned, protecting their citizens. They can't do that yet. So, number one, weaknesses. Number two, what are you doing about them? And I'll close on this. I could do this report for half the price. I don't know why.
Dan, thank you for your comments. We want this to be a dialogue and debate, so we'd like to open this up to the audience. So if you have questions, first of all, just raise your hand, state your name, your affiliation, and then ask away. So go ahead, please, stand up.
I'm Charlie Passanante from International Investor, and I was just wondering if you guys had a probable solution for a response to the Chinese military activity in the South China Sea, and what the international community should do about it to try and, put a handle on the situation. Really to anyone there.
So this view is not widely accepted or popular, but I look around the room and usually I'm 20 years younger than everyone else in the room, but this is a unique opportunity, it looks like, for me to talk to more people in my generation. So maybe this makes more sense. When we talk about the Cold War paradigm, people always say, we're not containing China. I see a Cold War paralysis in the thinking that is way beyond that. And it's this view that our relationship with China is like what it is with the Soviet Union, right? Any conflict in Asia would either be World War III or would escalate to a nuclear holocaust, right? We have this worst case scenario based on what happened with the Soviet Union, which, here was a very scary time, but like most of you in this room, I didn't live through it. So I don't understand why we have that view, but a big part of that comes from this overemphasis on crisis management. The United States wants to de-escalate regardless of what is happening. We don't care what China does. We don't care how people respond. The response on our side is de-escalate, de-escalate, de-escalate. We want to manage the risk. Now, another sort of idea that comes from history is inadvertent escalation. The Chinese don't believe in it. They don't believe. That's why they don't think it's risky. They don't believe that all of a sudden countries fall into war and they're like, how did I get here? China believes that countries go to war when they're like, let's go to war with this country. Right, so we're always worried about this inadvertent escalation. So our focus is always on de-escalate and manage the risk. China knows this, and they exploit it. But so my view is, with all this coercive diplomacy, we have to be more risk acceptant. I don't think wars happen because two airplanes collide. Wars happen because two airplanes collide. Leaders in D.C. and in Beijing say, do we have to fight a war with these people? Yes or no? Is now the time? Yes or no? And then they make the decision. And so I would say that if we want to reduce China's coercive diplomacy, we have to show them that they can't convince the United States to back off by manipulating risk. That we're willing to stand our ground, when they engage in dangerous maneuvers. Telling the the Chinese are dangerous doesn't get us anywhere. That's what they do it on purpose.
I think it's a great question. I agree with a lot of what Oriana said. I think that if we're in this game to stay, then absolutely we have to be more risk assessment. So, South China Sea. Every time the Chinese press on a territory, they should lose territory, or they should lose their claims and rights to territory. Every time they grab and push on an issue, we should make a claim that actually we're not neutral on how the final disposition of that territory is decided, because we're not neutral. We have international law on our side. 200, 300 years of it, we should say international law says that this piece of territory is decided on land features only, not on historical claims, not on anything else. You want to push it on us, you're going to lose another territory. You want to push on the Senkaku Daitai issue, let's go back to 1970 before the Reversion Treaty, because our position back then was that it was Japanese territory. Don't push us, you'll lose. Every time they push, they should lose ground. In terms of counter-coercion, the Philippines, there's all kinds of things it can do. You can convoy fishermen to their fisheries. The U.S. can do that. We're not going to go dislodge the Chinese. That's probably too risky, and nobody wants to see a shooting war. You can effectively negate the effects of what China has done in those areas. You can convoy. DoD put out a counter-coercive kit when President Obama was in Asia. You can put more pressure on China to back off in their own territories. But basically, the message has to be sent that if you push on these territorial issues, the U.S. is no longer neutral. The U.S. is going to come down on one side or the other, and the U.S. is going to assure that its allies can in effect, use those territories the way it was using them before.
Yeah, just very quickly, in terms of the South China Sea or the East China Sea territorial disputes, very quickly, let me sort of pull a string that Dan put out that I think is extremely important, and what I believe actually is the key driver for understanding and interpreting Chinese foreign policy, domestic policy for that well. That's the issue of political legitimacy. In terms of what's very different from us, the idea of political legitimacy as a key driver for foreign policy actions and policies, I think, is fundamental. And when you look at what are the threats to political legitimacy and from Beijing, the most significant threat, actually it's outlined in some contexts when they talk about core interests, which there originally have been three: Xinjiang, Tibet, and Taiwan. There's some ambivalent sort of views over the South China Sea, but you wonder, okay, what threat does activities or other Southeast Asians present by some of the territorial disputes? What threat is that to Chinese political legitimacy, CCP political legitimacy? There probably is one out there, but economic explanations for what China does and doesn't do. I'm sure that's one explanation, but I'm not sure it's the whole thing. The most significant threat to Chinese political legitimacy is Taiwan. It's a competing Chinese society that's a democracy that poses an existential threat to the monopoly that the Chinese Communist Party holds on power. That is a legitimacy in anything within the international community. That legitimacy is viewed in the cross-strait context as a zero-sum game. And so South China Sea, East China Sea, it's important, but sometimes I wonder if these are actual diversions, because the effect of what it has here in Washington, D.C. is that nobody talks about Taiwan anymore. Sometimes I like to think of an analogy of third-grade soccer players. Third-grade soccer players just run to the ball everywhere and not think about the big game. The key, as this report still says, the main driver for PLA is Taiwan. Not necessarily South China Sea. I mean, there's so many off-ramps of South China Sea. Sometimes it just makes me think of third-grade soccer. You just wonder, is there some sort of at least indirect way of that in terms of how it relates to Taiwan? I would just throw this out in terms of thinking about the problem and potential solutions. Is really figuring out and answering the question, what's really driving this? And somehow, does it relate to Taiwan? Just throw that out.
Thanks, Mark. I think we have time for two more questions. Let's take them in sequence. Sir, if you'd stand up and name and affiliation.
Rick Fisher, IISC. Thank you for holding this event. We're very lucky to have two author processors of the Pentagon report. And my question is as follows. Fortunately or unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember the old Soviet military reports of the 1980s. And they had two fantastic effects and one unintended effect. The first effect was that it promoted a consensus within Washington that we had to do something about a threat. It presented the threat in an undeniable photographic, graphic term, and that was simply undeniable. Secondly, it assisted our ability to lead our alliance in a huge way, because we convinced our allies about the seriousness of this threat, and it was easier for them to make decisions about their defense budgets, follow us, and see history to its conclusion. The unintended effect was that it was read widely within the Soviet bloc, and it significantly undermined within the Soviet bloc support for Soviet policies basically against the rest of the world. So my question is, especially to our former processors, how do we make this Pentagon report far more effective in serving those goals? How do we expand it? How do we prompt the Congress to request the legislation that affects a much more effective, visible report that advances our goals here in Washington, within our alliance, and hopefully within China?
And if the young lady will ask a quick question, you had your hand raised?
Yes.
Quick one, and then we'll have everyone answer.
Okay. I'm Oriana Mastro from Arms Control Today, and now you've all touched on this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on the impact of China developing a credible sea-based nuclear deterrent.
Go ahead.
Okay.
On the Rick Fisher's question, we definitely made an attempt to make it more like, the Soviet military. I mean, as Oriana hinted, most of you were probably in diapers when those things were still coming out, and I was pretty. I was just out of diapers for the most part, it was much smaller, glossier, kind of cartoonish in a way, more easily digestible ways of pointing out Soviet military power, and both to do so, it had the purposes that Rick Fisher said, which was to undermine support in the bloc, but it also and build up alliances, but it also to justify defense budgets here in the United States. But it didn't operate in a vacuum. The problem here is, and I think Oriana also alluded to this, which is we're not really sure what our China. So containment was the policy, and containment was the strategy of the Soviet Union. Everything else, we had arguments about it, but everything flew, from that basically. Going to keep the Western front. We're going to have a maritime strategy, whatever. We're just not going to let the Soviets cross over and expand territory, into Western Europe and so on. And then we had all kinds of different ways that we were going to make sure they didn't do that. And one of them was these competitive strategies that I think we were all alluding to in terms of taking advantage of the Soviet weaknesses, pointing out their weaknesses, testing their weaknesses. So it was in a bigger context. I think we still don't, believe it or not, have a coherent policy in terms of what we actually want for China. We said responsible stakeholder, but Oriana pointed out the very big risks of China playing a greater role in the world stage. We don't know what we want. I mean, peaceful evolution kind of had clarity to it, but it was abandoned. China becoming a democratic member of the world community. So this is much more difficult. We have 5, 6, 7 China policies, at least. I mean, maybe even 100 now. I mean, you used to go to interagency meetings 10 years ago, and there were, if you talk to Treasury and Agriculture, they would have their own China policy. And that was probably expanded. So it's been attempted. It's much more difficult to do. I think you can affect things at the margin, as we've all suggested, by focusing on political warfare, by focusing on weaknesses, and by focusing on what you can do about it. But until the nation as a whole decides that China is what we want on China, I don't really see a role for I don't see it happening. We've tried it. I don't see the same sort of Soviet military threat happening, and I don't see the same effect in China. As much as China lacks political legitimacy, most Chinese, I think, are very proud of their power. So I don't see it having this effect.
I would say, Rick, I'm sure you follow some of the commentary that comes out of China by those within China that follow the military. You know, your military, sort of military fans of any military, just simply watch military issues. In this report, my impression is that it's viewed within a certain sector within China who just follow the PLA, just like America, some of us in the U.S. do, as an objective sort of look, and they use it, they refer to it, and they use it just like anybody else. And so I would say the first thing to do is just continue to try to make it as close to objectivity as possible, present facts and interpretations, and I think that it would continue to be used as a valid reference by those within China. Of course, more details are always good. That's one thing. And the second thing I think that would be quite useful, again, just at risk of continuing to beat on this, but it's, if you remember the Soviet military power report, there was that accompanying report on KGB Service A active measures. The PLA does not, there's some similarities between them and the Soviet Communist Party and some differences. And one of the main differences is that whereas the Soviet Union in their political warfare active measures uses KGB Service A, the People's Republic of China, Chinese Communist Party, primarily uses the General Political Department. They have that mission. And so a little bit more to be able to focus on activities of the General Political Department in terms of what they do in their version of active measures, which has been going on since the 1930s. Sort of united with which we call sort of influence operation, united front operation, these sort of things. I think could have significant impact in terms of following within China. Because bear in mind that political warfare has no boundaries. Similar organizations that do work within China and do work outside of China are very much the same. And this is an organization that's, if you can imagine like a DIA, Defense Intelligence Agency, or NRO, for example, of that size and that stature is dedicated to nothing but political warfare and influence operations within China and outside of China. It's all integrated. So I think that would have a significant impact as well.
And Oriana, before if you could answer the arms control today's question. And also I'll just point out the China Military Power Report, the 2012 version, used to have a list, authoritative list of estimates for Chinese missile forces, ICBMs, IRBMs, SRBMs. It no longer has that. And I think it's a big omission. I know some members of Congress were trying to get the DoD to reinsert this new sort of estimate information just so we have a baseline. These forces are modernizing and evolving. So anyways, Oriana, please.
Good. I'll start and answer the credible sea-based deterrent question. Timing in identifying sort of factors and variables that are impacting Chinese decisions is always very tricky. And I think a lot of times we forget about sort of the feedback loop, which is the reasons why China does something is not necessarily going to inform us of how they're going to use that capability in the future. Because then they have that capability and they think, oh, I never thought about doing this, that, and the other before. But I think largely the desire to develop that sea-based deterrent was driven more by imitation. The great powers have it, they want to have it. I do, different from people who are sort of nuclear policy experts, I'm a China person, so I do believe in the Chinese focus on defensive use of nuclear weapons. I believe that it's real. However, I am concerned every day, the day that the Chinese start using nuclear weapons the way the Pakistanis do, right? By trying to deter conventionally superior countries with the threat of using nuclear weapons, I mean, then as a defense plan, I don't know what we're going to do in that situation. Because it's a balance of resolve issue with the United States, not balance of capabilities. We're stronger than the Chinese. Our military is vastly superior to that of the Chinese. The question is, what resources are we going to expend towards the conflict? And the Chinese are pretty confident that the answer is not that many. Going just to briefly mention the debate, what Rick said about maybe the downsides of sort of moderates losing support in China. Unfortunately, in Chinese debates, I don't see a lot of debate about what the goals are. I see debate about the timing and maybe the methods. There seems to be a general consensus that life would be a lot better if the United States would militarily disengage from the region and China could be the regional hegemon. Now there's debates. Moderates would say, you know, let's not do that through war, or maybe let's not do that right now because we're not as strong as we think we do. But I fundamentally believe the problem is in those goals. It's a conflict because the United States, ideally, is determined on state. This goes to the point of maybe we haven't decided what costs are we willing to pay to maintain our position in the region. But in general, it's hard to shape Chinese views on this because they suffer from the opposite of misattribution bias, which is, in the United States, we believe everything other countries do is in response to us. In China, They don't believe that anything other countries are doing is in response to what they're doing. And so it is a difficult job to try to demonstrate those cause and effect links to Chinese officials and say, this happened because of something you did, and try to get them to therefore be more moderate about their behavior.
Mark, you wanted to add a quick point?
Well, on the SLB and the submarine launch ballistic missile issue, to me the most significant aspect in this development, or the significant question, is who has or will have peacetime custodianship over the warheads that would be allocated toward use on these platforms. That's the most significant question. The reason why I raise this is that sometimes we beat up on the PRC, on a lot of the PLA, and I actually like to say something positive about China, and that's their method of storing and handling nuclear weapons, I would argue, is the safest and most secure approach in the world. I'm not that familiar with the way the UK or France, or I'm somewhat familiar with Russia, and something with the US, but China has had a very, I think, effective way of ensuring the safety and stability of their nuclear stockpile. And because it's centralized management. Centralized management is the way they've done it in the past, under one particular, again, core level organization. And if the Navy now has custodianship, particularly, for example, North Sea Fleet or South Sea Fleet, has their own peacetime custodianship of the warheads, not about the missiles, and the boat drivers are going to be, of course, Navy, but those warheads themselves, is that going to continue to be 22 base, second artillery, in terms of maintaining positive control of those warheads at peacetime? Or are they going to now, or does the Navy already have their own peacetime custodianship? That can have a ripple effect, because you're going to have every one of the 6 of the missile bases saying, hey, how come we don't have a larger stockpile, our own stockpile? The Air Force is going to ask the same question. So in terms of with an internal proliferation problem, in terms of bureaucratic dynamics, organization dynamics, I think that's the most important question.
I'd like to thank you in the audience and our speakers also for coming out today to have this conversation. Again, this China Military Power Report talks about an aspect of the U.S.-China relationship. There's lots to talk about, so I don't want anyone to walk away from this thinking that this relationship is entirely military. But it's an important dimension of this relationship, and we need to look at it honestly, soberly, and act accordingly. So thank you for coming out. Thank you to the speakers. Until the next time, thank you. Hey, good to see you. Holy cow. You live stream it? You're around next week.